100. In 2019, Nove Tocco, a dying mobster, made a statement that stunned the entire world. 100. During a panel commemorating 50 years since Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, he implied that no one would believe the truth because it was so absurd. 100. There was more than simply union workers' money that Hoffa was missing. According to new FBI files, murders had been authorized by him. Get out of here. 100. Take the weapon away from him. Hitmen and weaponry were purchased with more than $50 million in pension funds. In addition, contrary to popular belief, 100. The traitor who betrayed him wasn't the one everyone expected. All our prior knowledge of that day in 1975 is now shattered by the most recent evidence. Jimmy Hoffa came into this world in a humble home in Brazil, Indiana on February 14, 1913. He was born into a world where the attending physician had no idea it was a baby. In his mind, Viola, Jimmy's mom, had a tumor. 100. That's the level of unpredictability and how bad things was. The term tumor was used in jest. His life, nevertheless, would be anything but funny. 100. The coal mine blacksmith John Cleveland Hoffa was his father's occupation. In order to provide for his family, he rode a mule through several counties. 100. On North Vanilla Street, they resided in a modest 3-room dwelling. The center chamber was the birthplace of Jimmy. His father's income was low. 100. For quality control, he had to use his teeth to bite into coal. Life was so much more difficult in those days, and Jimmy was there the whole time. Everything fell apart for Jimmy when he was only 7 years old. In a mental institution, his father passed away on October 19, 1920. 100. His loved ones thought the coal dust killed him, even though the official reason was universal paralysis of the crazy. For 4 months, he had been ill. They couldn't afford to postpone the funeral, so he passed away and was laid to rest on the same day. After losing her husband. 100. Viola had to work nonstop to support their 4 children. She was a maid, a restaurant cook, and the owner of a laundry service out of her home. 100. Jimmy and his siblings went door to door to deliver the garments. In search of a better life, Jimmy's family relocated to Detroit in 1924. 100. When he was 11 years old. Detroit, though, was cruel. While he was 14 years old, Jimmy was employed as a stock boy. He had found employment at a Kroger warehouse by 1929. There was a pitiful hourly wage of 32 cents. He had to wait 12-15 hours a day every day. 100. Simply for shipments. And that was the toughest part. Not having to wait cost them anything. They were only charged for the cargo when it arrived. Periodically, absolutely nothing materialized. Their supervisor made them feel like they didn't matter. Nobody had a good reason to terminate anyone. Nothing was guaranteed, including employment or benefits. It felt suffocating. And Jimmy could perceive the system's design as a means to subjugate employees similar to himself. On April 13, 1930, everything changed. 100. Jimmy accomplished something remarkable while being only 17 years old. The warehouse was visited by a trailer laden with cantaloupes and strawberries. 100. Because Jimmy was aware of how quickly fruit spoils, he gathered a crew and refused to remove the goods from the trailer. They did nothing but wait. 100. Arms folded. Some time elapsed. Sunlight caused the fruit to deteriorate. Management was taken aback. Jimmy refused to give in to their pressure tactics. The corporation caved in within the hour. Greater pay and insurance benefits were mutually agreed upon. Jimmy became victorious with that. And in that instant, he became a legend. The 1930s in Detroit were the worst. The car factories looked like battlegrounds. Jimmy's mom was a radiator cap polisher at a Pfizer body shop. Long shifts were required. The salary was horrible. Everything was unprotected. 100. No one seemed to mind when people lost limbs to machines. You were treated like trash if you were hurt. Company goons used bats and brass knuckles to beat union organizers. Workers were often detained by the police. 100. Something crucial was very clear to Jimmy when he watched this. You needed equal, or perhaps greater strength to combat a violent system. Jimmy made his bold move in 1932 when he was only 19 years old. He continued to work at the Kroger warehouse, making the exact same 32 cents per hour. 100. Once again, a strawberry-laden train car arrived, and Jimmy recalled the strategy that had been successful previously. 100. He warned the employees against unloading. He claimed they had established their own union this time. Once again, the corporation was overtaken by terror. They were concerned about the fruit going bad, so, within an hour, they consented to all of Jimmy's requests. Teamsters Local 299 took notice of the moment. They hired him full-time as an organizer in 1933. Tragic violence befell him in the same year. 100. Jimmy endured several beatings during the 1933 Detroit laundry workers' strike. His scalp was sliced 6 times by the cops and the men from the corporation. 100. He returned to the picket line after being arrested 24 times in one day. The experience taught him something. Kindness isn't enough to win. Strength is what really matters. Stay one step ahead of the competition at all times. It's the way to win. He started ruling by that. 100. While on a laundry strike, he crossed paths with Josephine Hosawak, a young woman. She had only just turned 18. 100. He compared it as taking a blackjack to the chest. Bowling Green, Ohio was the site of their 1936 wedding. At the age of 19, Josephine entered this world. Barbara and James Jr. were their children. They paid $600 to $800 for a home in Detroit's Northwest neighborhood in 1939. 100. It was in this same city that Jimmy would lay the foundation for his vast empire, even though Josephine was by his side through thick and thin. A sinister alliance was the driving force behind his success. Jimmy struck an agreement with Angelo Milley in 1937. Milley was a Detroit mob boss who posed a threat. Murder and armed robbery were charges against him, but he was rarely found guilty. Jimmy required strength, 100, which Milley supplied. In exchange, the mob gained authority over the workforce. Jimmy was shielded. Their strength increased as a unit. 100. The Teamsters' shady history with organized crime began with this. The Strawberry Boys, an enforcement squad named after Jimmy's infamous fruit strike. 100 were formed by 1939. This group of men wasn't calm. They had firearms, chains, and bats. Anybody who didn't want to be a union member was beaten. 100. If employers refused to comply, they resorted to bombing trucks and even residences. Jimmy had made his point quite plain. 100. Get on board with the union or face the music. That was successful. Participation skyrocketed. Pay increased. Unstoppable were the Teamsters. Jimmy formally took over as president of Local 299 in the same year. Despite popular belief, he was just 24 years old when it happened, not 1940. Jimmy turned around the local, which had been in the red. In 1940, he had crossed state lines in managing contracts. 100. Pay increases for drivers ranged from 20% to 50% to negotiate on behalf of the entire state. He established the Michigan Conference of Teamsters in 1942. That granted him even greater authority. Another bloody chapter in the history of the Detroit labor movement occurred in May 1937. The UAW was the group in question, not Jimmy. 100. At Ford's River Rouge facility, they were severely beaten while passing out pamphlets. An assault occurred on Richard Frankenstein and Walter Ruther. Dreaded. Although Jimmy wasn't present, everything transpired while he was getting ready to rise. Also, 100. The level of brutality in the labor disputes was demonstrated by the violence that day. Jimmy had spread the Teamsters across the Midwest by 1946. 100. Countless contracts were under his control. On the other hand, he began to do something dangerous. Pension funds were instruments of his dominance. He was instrumental in the establishment of the State Pension Fund in 1955. The amount became $2.2 billion. Banks and mob-backed enterprises received loans from him. That encompassed Caesar's Palace and the Stardust, two of Las Vegas's most famous casinos. 100. The union benefited from these accords, but the mob also benefited. That would follow him around like a shadow. 100. Jimmy joined forces with Dave Beck in the early 1950s. Beck would go on to become the Teamsters president in 1952. Jimmy got good results, according to Beck. 100. Though they engaged in dubious dealings, he confessed, "I wish I had 40 more like him." Payoffs were made in order to seize power. 100. They established fictitious union locals. Beck was found guilty of tax fraud in 1959. Jimmy gave a testimony before the Senate in the same year. After being asked 111 questions, he insisted he couldn't recall the answers. It was obvious to everyone. A huge dent was punched to the Teamsters' credibility. After years of trying, Jimmy Hoffa finally succeeded in 1957, after Dave Beck was found squandering $150,000 in union funds to improve his estate. 100. He assumed the role of president of the Teamsters at the Miami Beach Convention. Hoffa acted immediately. The 1.5 million strong Teamsters Union became the most influential in the nation under his tyrannical rule. In 1964, he made history by negotiating a single contract that included 450,000 truck drivers in North America. 100. Because of the authority bestowed upon him by that arrangement, not even Robert F. 100. Kennedy dared to say that Hoffa was second only to the president in terms of national power. The Teamsters were expelled from the AFL-CIO that year by a resounding vote. and Hoffa couldn't care less. He benefited from it. With the 840,000 he saved each year in dues, he was able to fortify his own empire. The Senate hearings of 1958 followed. For about a month, they made Hoffa the center of attention. Every day he was interrogated by Robert Kennedy, the chief lawyer. Hearings exposed Hoffa's extensive connections to organized crime. The worst part was when his link to Paul Dorfman, a prominent Chicago crime member, was revealed. Following the discovery of the original leader's body, Paul assumed control of the Waste Handlers Union. Lee Harvey Oswald's assassin, Jack Ruby, was a fellow officer in his town. Alan Dorfman, Paul's son, was given more than $3 million in insurance policies by Hoffa. According to the committee's findings, with $165 million of those payments being totally superfluous, $200 in 1949 to $160, $658 in 1954. For the 111th time in that session, Hoffa denied remembering anything when questioned about it all. Hoffa had started cleaning houses by 1959. After he removed corrupt local officials. He installed his own loyal men to take their places, further consolidating his power. Simultaneously, he began underground casino funding with Teamster pension funds. The Dunes Hotel was approved for $4 million in 1958, and newspaper mogul Hank Greenspun was given $250,000 by him. After that, he built Sunrise Hospital by giving $1 million to Mo Dallas, a former mobster from Cleveland. Both the Stardust I-6 million and the Fremont $4 million received his approval in 1960 and 1961, respectively. Visitors continued to pour in for Caesar's Palace, Landmark, Aladdin, and Circus in the years that followed. Later estimates by officials put the mob's take from these casinos at $300 million. Hoffa launched a brand new program named Drive in 1960. Although it was intended to inform voters, in reality, it served as a veil for illicit contributions to political campaigns. 50 cents a month from every Teamster member would have made $900 million a year. Hoffa bribed lawmakers and funneled funds through rich contributors using this money to further shield his friends. He also contributed to the re-election campaigns of judges in Detroit. Frank Fitzsimmons, who was his right-hand man, was exonerated from corruption charges by one of those judges. Hoffa had become entrenched in the political system to the point that no one could reach him. Things became risky. Nevertheless, in 1961, subsequently, dynamite was placed beneath Hoffa's vehicle. A message was being sent by the mob. His independence had grown old to some criminal families, and they wanted him out. The FBI reasoned that the fear that Hoffa might become uncontrollable was actually expressed by rival mob bosses. Even though certain Southern leaders, such as Santos Traficante and Carlos Marcello, continued to back him, others were beginning to align themselves with Fitzsimmons. There was clearly not enough time for Hoffa after the explosive attempt failed. Robert F. Kennedy was appointed Attorney General in the same year. He assembled the group that would later be called the Get Hoffa Squad. Hoffa was the sole target of this specially assembled squad. Kennedy held the view that Hoffa was avaricious, aggressive, and shady. Hoffa said the Kennedys were useless aristocrats who didn't have any empathy for the common man. When their rivalry escalated to a personal level, Kennedy resolved to undermine Hoffa. In the summer of 1962, the situation deteriorated worse. Hoffa was overheard discussing assassinating Robert Kennedy in clandestine wiretaps. Since Kennedy had so little protection, he assured Edward Parton that it would be easy. John F. Kennedy instructed journalist Ben Bradley to inform the public about the conspiracy so that Hoffa would desist from continuing. Bobby Kennedy wanted it to remain under wraps so that it wouldn't influence the trials. After helping prosecutors construct their case, Parton became an important witness in Hoffa's jury manipulation case after passing a lie detector exam. The Teamsters Convention in 1963 was the turning point for Hoffa. He successfully negotiated a $240 million pension loan for developers of casinos in Las Vegas who were associated with organized crime. At that point, the pension fund's value had risen to $213 million, with the majority of that sum going toward financed initiatives. Jay was even set up by Hoffa. Sarno, who oversaw Caesar's Palace from 1965 to 1972, would receive $20.4 million. With every loan, Hoffa also pocketed 10% in kickbacks. It was a foolproof method of secretly taking money. In a $25 million pension fund scam, Hoffa was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud in a Chicago court on July 26, 1964, after approving $20 million in fraudulent loans. He and his associates pocketed $1.7 million in bribes. 13 weeks ended with the trial. 100. An irate attorney representing Hoffa hurled money at the prosecution while shouting that they had sold their souls because they were so hopeless. 100. In addition to the 8 years Hoffa served for jury manipulation, he received 5 years for each additional offense. Despite his conviction, Hoffa continued to pursue the Kennedys in 1965 using Union cash. An anti-Kennedy smear campaign received millions of dollars from him. He attempted to paint the Kennedys as pawns of the mob by printing and widely disseminating false information. While still entangled in mob deals, he manages all this. Even when Bobby Kennedy resigned from the Justice Department to seek the Senate, he continued this. In 1964, Hoffa offered Grattenfields $10,000 to bribe a juror and thus began his judicial nightmare. His sentencing was placed in Chattanooga on March 4, 1964. His sentence for fraud and conspiracy was 8 years in prison plus 5 more. Through appeals, he was able to postpone his sentencing until March 1967. His enemies were able to seize control because of that. Upon reaching prison, Hoffa showed no signs of relenting. He exercised his mini-empire management skills at Lewisburg Penitentiary. According to Time, 100. These inmates were the most influential jail population in history. He maintained complete control, intimidated guards, and assembled a team that comprised a presidential assistant, a TAM leader, a colonel of the army, business people, and even a PhD. 100. Hoffa warned a guard who attempted to steal a prisoner's legal books that they would sue him till he lost consciousness. Putting his faith in Frank Fitzsimmons to fill in for him was his worst error. Frank, in Hoffa's opinion, was feeble. But after Hoffa was in prison, 100, Fitzsimmons became the dominant figure. He let Hoffa's friends and allies go, and he even demoted his wife. 100. The pension fund was given over to the mob without any questions asked by Fitzsimmons, who became Nixon's golfing partner. 100. The command structure of Hoffa had collapsed. The reality about Lewisburg life was eventually revealed to him. He went on to say that narcotics were pervasive. 100 inmates waited in line for their heroin hash pills. Guards, not tourists, were the ones smuggling it in, he claimed, randomly spraying mace. Some guards made their way through solitary confinement. Hoffa's testimony both shocked and further isolated him. Nixon put a trap to Hoffa's commutation of sentence in December 1971. Up to 1980, Hoffa could not work for a union. 100. The restriction was made known to him the day following his release. He asserted in 1974 that it was not included in the agreement and attempted to contest it in court. Hoffa allegedly paid 300 Zellhosens for the commutation. 100, according to some. Some claim that Tony Provenzano paid Nixon $500,000 to keep Hoffa from ever being involved with the Teamsters. 100, that was successful. Hoffa had freedom, but she had no authority. Nevertheless, he persisted. Hoffa met clandestinely with crime bosses, including Tony Provenzano in 1972 in an effort to regain access. 100. The gang did not want him to interfere with the pension fund, which had grown to $1.4 billion while he was in prison. 100. Things escalated physically when Hoffa declined to provide Provenzano greater authority. According to eyewitnesses, the two genuinely fought. Afterwards, Provenzano told him to leave or perish. By suing Fitzsimmons for embezzlement in 1973, Hoffa exposed the theft of union funds through phony jobs. His sibling received a $37,700 for services he did not render. Ghost payrolls were receiving more than $1 million annually, according to Hoffa's proof. Audio recordings of Fitzsimmons discussing the theft surfaced through wiretaps. All Hoffa wanted to do was set it on fire. In 1974, 100, there was yet another attempt at assassination. Once again, Hoffa's assailants sought to eliminate him in Detroit. At this point, hundreds, it was associated with the men of Fitzsimmons. To intimidate Hoffa's followers, a gang headed by Big Mac McMaster threw bombs and beat them. As a response, Hoffa fought back. At a Detroit pub, someone bombed Fitzsimmons' son's automobile just 20 days before he went missing. Jimmy Hoffa felt stifled in early 1975. His parole was contingent upon him abstaining from any association with the Teamsters Union until the year 1980. 100. He held his successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, responsible. Fitzsimmons may have conspired with Nixon's inner circle to arrange for Hoffa's early release. 100. According to the evidence Hoffa had uncovered, the Teamsters donated almost $100 million to Hoffa's campaign as part of the agreement that released him. A snag, 100, nevertheless, was present. No Hoffa could participate in union events. According to documents and letters discovered by Hoffa, Nixon's advisor Chuck Colson and Fitzsimmons discussed the scheme. 100. Hoffa threatened to go public with his feelings of betrayal unless Fitzsimmons resigned and allowed him to return. Nevertheless, Fitzsimmons persisted. 100. Rather than relinquish control, he fortified his connections to the mob. The Union and the entire underworld were both made vulnerable by Hoffa's threat. 100. He had stepped over the boundary, and he had no idea how isolated he was getting. At about the same time, 100, the Federal Bureau of Investigations was keeping a careful eye on this. In 1975, confidential documents were made public. 100, revealing the extent to which Hoffa had benefited the gang from the Teamsters Pension Fund. Nearly $1.5 billion had been added to what had begun as $400 million. Retirement funds, however, were not included. It was being utilized to finance other forms of violence, including loan sharking and hits. 100 Hoffa sanctioned loans to convicted murderers in collaboration with Alan Dorfman, who was deeply involved with the Chicago mob. Hoffa approved deals that paid for murders in at least 15 other states. 100. The wiretaps even caught Hoffa discussing the plans to use the funds to hire assassins and purchase weapons. 100. There was a direct correlation between violent crimes and more than $50 million in pension loans. Hoffa wasn't merely being circumspect. He was an integral part of a network that used union funds to facilitate murders for hire. At a Teamsters wedding in New Jersey in June 1975, 100, things reached a boiling point. In front of all eyes, Hoffa and Tony Pro, a mobster, squared off. A power struggle broke out at Union City's Teamster Local 560. Hoffa said Tony Pro had taken control without her consent. Supposedly, the two began yelling at each other. 100 Tony Pro proceeded to force Hoffa into a wedding cake-filled table. But that was far from the end. According to FBI informant Frank Sheeran, 100, Tony Pro made a threatening threat to murder Hoffa and his grandchildren while staring him down in the eyes. Witnesses gazed in disbelief as security personnel separated them. A few days down the road, the FBI observed Provenzano's henchmen relocating weapons and establishing safe homes. Tony Pro was already committed. Hoffa had publicly shamed him, and the bill was now due. At the Match's Red Fox restaurant close to Detroit, Hoffa met Tony Pro and Tony Gaccalone on July 30, 1975. To him, 100, it seemed like they were prepared to talk about reconciling and reintegrating him into the Union. 100. 2 o'clock in the afternoon was the time chosen for the gathering. Hoffa was the only one that arrived promptly, while everyone else was late. He used a pay phone to contact his wife around 2015. He expressed frustration and bewilderment over their non-arrival. By 400, he promised to be home and ready to grill steaks for supper. He was completely unaware that he was about to step into a trap. 100 Tony Gaccalone and Tony Pro had never intended to show up. The FBI found Tony Pro and Tony Gaccalone, who both had good alibis. 100 playing cards in New Jersey and a Detroit social club, respectively. Hoffa was in place. Worse enough, the trap was placed by someone Hoffa trusted. The foster son of Hoffa, Charles Chucky O'Brien, had stolen a 1975 Mercury Marquis in maroon from Tony's son, Joe Gaccalone. 100 Hoffa allegedly boarded that vehicle that day with 3 others, according to eyewitnesses. Police cannons sniffed out Hoffa's scent in the trunk and back seat. 100, contradicting O'Brien's story that he was delivering a 40-pound frozen salmon to a friend. 100, the presence of O'Brien's fingerprints and hair on a 7-Up bottle in the vehicle was later determined to be Hoffa's by DNA testing. It was never his home. 100, one of the biggest search missions in U.S. history was initiated by the FBI 11 days following the disappearance. 100, they claimed to have substantial evidence that the Mercury was involved in Hoffa's kidnapping, so they obtained a warrant for it on August 8, 1975. 100, several states were covered as they combed through barns, ranches, and dumps. As O'Brien had predicted, they discovered blood on the car seat, but it was actually blood from fish. Nonetheless, in 1977, for $6,000, the FBI acquired the vehicle, 100, which they then utilized as a postal vehicle while preserving it as evidence. Despite spending millions, Hoffa's body was never located. The grand jury then heard evidence that implicated Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Brigiglio in the murder in 1976. According to the FBI, Hoffa was probably abducted and taken to a residence in Detroit, where he was shot. The next step was to transport his corpse to a mob-rolled sanitation company in Hamrack. Nothing was discovered during the search by the FBI. 100, a fire broke out in that very structure a few months later for no apparent reason. The crime site had been vandalized by the mob. Even with the testimony of Sally Bugs, a notorious mob hitman, the facts remained hidden. Hoffa was formally pronounced dead on December 9, 1982, 100, which was 7 years and 4 months after he disappeared. Theorizing, however, persisted. A mobster named Charles Allen, who had served time alongside Hoffa. 100 informed a Senate committee that same year that Hoffa had been dismembered, his body transported to Florida, and then buried in a swamp. Another assassin, Donald Tony the Greek Franco, made the same allegation that Hoffa was buried under New Jersey's Giant Stadium in 1989. 100. The Jimmy Hoffa End Zone was the moniker given to that location. However, during the stadium's demolition in 2010, no artifacts were discovered. In 1993, the FBI's premier theory was presented. A wiretap caught Tony Palatolo, a mobster from Detroit, boasting that he had ground Hoffa's corpse into meat. 100. According to the prosecution, mob boss Joe Zerilli gave the order for the hit to be carried out by Palatolo, Billy Gaccaloni, and Sally Bugs. 100. Hoffa allegedly suffered beatings and strangulation in a residence in Franklin Village. 100. Which was within 10 minutes of a social club that the Gaccalone controlled, according to an informant. Another mob-connected sanitation plant that burned down also had his body incinerated. The perfect crime, as crime writer Scott Bernstein put it, was the description. Strange stories continued to pour in, according to mobster Marvin Aland, who testified in 1989. 100. Someone allegedly told him to greet Jimmy Hoffa in the morning, while pointing to the Renaissance Center in Detroit. 100. Suggesting that Hoffa's body was buried beneath it. In 1976, when building the stadium, workers discovered numerous bodies, but none of them belonged to Hoffa. 100. Their goal was to prevent delays, so they eventually ceased reporting them. Before his own death in 2019, 100. Frank Capola informed investigator Dan Mula that his father Paul had assisted with the burial of Hoffa in the Jersey City PJP landfill. 100. Frank made his oath affirming that his father had told him. 100. This is where Jimmy Hoffa is buried. The father was pointing to a location beneath the Pulaski Skyway. According to him, the corpse was interred with dozens of chemical barrels after being placed headfirst into a 55-gallon drum. Despite the FBI's best efforts in 2021 and 2022, they came up empty-handed. Strangely, in 1975 the FBI had also looked through the trash, but they had given up without clear instructions. 100. Hoffa left an enormous impression, even if his remains were never located. The Teamsters became the nation's most influential union during his leadership. To unify all drivers under a single contract, he drafted the National Master Freight Agreement in 1964. For truck drivers, that was the sweet spot. Yet he tarnished the union's reputation as well. Las Vegas mobster Hoffa helped bankroll the Stardust, Desert Inn Dunes, Caesar's Palace, 100, and Circus with funds from the Teamsters. The pension fund that provided workers with a future was also utilized to strengthen the mob. 100. Here we see Hoffa's downfall. In 2019's The Irishman, directed by Martin Scorsese, Al Pacino portrayed him as a haughty guy whose pride got the best of him. On July 23, 2025, a group convened in Michigan to mark the half-century after his abduction. Scott Bernstein, a Mafia expert, ex-mobster Nove Tocco, and former prosecutor Richard Convertino all made public statements. Tocco uttered a statement that shocked everyone. 100. Telling the truth is sometimes more effective than telling a lie. That is precisely Tony's behavior.